Hello, hello, and welcome to the Thyroid Pharmacist Healing Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Izabella Wentz, and I'm so excited to have you here joining me to talk about thyroid health. I thought that today would be a good day to talk about whether you have Hashimoto's, hypothyroidism, or both. And to really clarify that conversation, I feel like we need to define each of these. So Hashimoto's is an autoimmune condition that impacts the thyroid gland, and it actually has 5 different stages. We'll get into what those stages are, but first I want to talk about hypothyroidism. So what is hypothyroidism? Hypothyroidism is a clinical state. So this means that basically you don't have enough circulating thyroid hormone in your body. Now, do you have Hashimoto's, hypothyroidism, or both, right? One thing that many people may not be aware of is if they have hypothyroidism, there's a really, really good chance that they have Hashimoto's. But if they have Hashimoto's, they might not actually have hypothyroidism. So Hashimoto's has 5 different stages. In the first stage of Hashimoto's, we have the genetic predisposition, but for all intents and purposes, the immune response against the thyroid gland is normal. We don't have any autoimmune antibodies against the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland is functioning perfectly. We have adequate levels of thyroid hormone, and we don't have any symptoms. Now, this is stage 1, so it's that genetic predisposition. Stage 2 of Hashimoto's is known as the time when Hashimoto's begins. At this stage, we start having that autoimmune infiltration of cells into the thyroid gland. They're starting to damage the thyroid gland. In many cases, people are still not hypothyroid. So their thyroid gland is under attack. It's being actively destroyed, but it's able to regenerate and sort of keep up the production of thyroid hormones and compensate for what's going on. This is usually a stage when people start having thyroid symptoms. They might present with anxiety, multiple miscarriages. They might have mood swings. They might have fertility challenges. Oftentimes, these are the people that will go to see their doctors and they will be diagnosed with a mental health issue, or they'll be told that they're a hypochondriac, that it's all in their head. But let me tell you, research will show that it's not all in your head. How you can test for this stage is actually using thyroid antibodies, TPO antibodies, thyroid peroxidase antibodies, and TG antibodies, known as thyroglobulin antibodies. And now you know why I say TPO and TG antibodies. It's kind of a mouthful. These are the 2 antibodies that can show up 10 years before there's a change in thyroid function. And these antibodies have been correlated with a whole host of different health challenges. Now, stage 3 of Hashimoto's is when you have that autoimmune attack against the thyroid gland. And so you have these thyroid antibodies present, and then you also start having subclinical hypothyroidism. What does that mean exactly? That means that your thyroid gland has been damaged to the point where it stops its ability to compensate. So it's no longer able to keep up the production of thyroid hormones because it's so damaged. At this point, you still might have normal levels of the thyroid hormones, the circulating thyroid hormones T3 and T4, but your TSH, or your thyroid stimulating hormone, might be slightly elevated. This elevation indicates that the pituitary has sensed that there's something going on, and it's telling your thyroid gland to ramp up its production of thyroid hormones. And the thyroid does. It sort of starts to compensate. Now, generally speaking, most doctors will say when the TSH is under 10, this is considered subclinical hypothyroidism. Yes, you can be symptomatic at that point, and unfortunately, many doctors will say, I'm not going to give you thyroid medications yet because it's too soon. Now, I am a big proponent of utilizing thyroid medications very early on in the process because, 1, they can slow down the autoimmune response, and 2, they can address a lot of the symptoms. Not all of the symptoms, but many of the symptoms can be helped by thyroid hormone. So just to give you a little bit of perspective, when I had subclinical hypothyroidism, my TSH was at 4.5 or 5.5, and I was losing hair. I had carpal tunnel in both arms. I was sleeping 11 to 12 hours a night, and I still felt exhausted. I had multiple allergies, acid reflux, irritable bowel syndrome, and I was just chronically exhausted. So fatigued and so darn cold all the time. I used to wear, like a shirt and a sweater and a scarf and a jacket, and I lived in Southern California, so it doesn't get that cold there. So just to give you a perspective, that subclinical hypothyroidism is stage 3 of Hashimoto's. Stage 4 of Hashimoto's is overt hypothyroidism. So at this stage, your thyroid gland has been under so much damage for such a long time that it's fully lost its ability to compensate. So the pituitary is saying, I'm seeing low levels of thyroid hormone, and it's increasing your TSH to say, ramp up the production. But that TSH just keeps climbing and climbing and climbing. The longer you've been hypothyroid, the higher the TSH. And your levels of the thyroid hormones T3 and T4 might be low. So if you were to do labs at this stage, you might have a TSH that's above 10. You might have low levels of T3 and T4. This is actually the stage when most people get diagnosed and they get put on thyroid medications. Now, this can be very, very deceiving because people will say, I'm going to get on thyroid medications. Everything's going to be great. I wish this was the case. If this was the case, I would have been still working as a public health pharmacist talking about other things that I found interesting at the time. This is not the case because, one, there are different types of thyroid hormones most conventional docs are not willing to touch that I love educating you about that sometimes can work better than the traditional meds. And two, there's this whole autoimmune component that we really, really need to address because that's going to cause a lot of residual symptoms as well as let the progression of Hashimoto's continue. So I mentioned there were 5 stages. We talked about stage 4 when most people get diagnosed with hypothyroidism. Stage 5 is actually progression to other autoimmune conditions. And I can't, tell you how many times I've had people reach out to me that said, I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism. I started my thyroid medications just as my doctor said, felt a little bit better, but a few years down the road, I developed another autoimmune condition. Rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, digestive issues, all of these things just sort of kept continuing. Anxiety, panic attacks, depression, miscarriages, fertility challenges. It can all be a sign of autoimmune disease in the body. Now, my passion lies in educating you about what to do when you have Hashimoto's and when you have hypothyroidism. Because if you have hypothyroidism, unless you've had your thyroid gland surgically removed, treated by radioactive iodine, or you were born without a thyroid, there's a really good chance, and the studies say anywhere from 90 to 97% of the time, if you live in the Western world, so that's the United States, that's Europe, that's Australia, any country that uses iodine in their salt supply, if you have hypothyroidism, there's I would say 97% chance that you have Hashimoto's, but potentially you haven't been tested. But if you have Hashimoto's, you may not be hypothyroid, right? So you can be in stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3 of Hashimoto's and not be quote unquote hypothyroid, but still be symptomatic. And you can be in stage 4 Hashimoto's when you did become hypothyroid, but when your doctor gives you thyroid hormone, you're no longer hypothyroid, right? You then have normal thyroid function. Of course, I'm assuming that they gave you the right dosage and the right type of medication for you, but you might still need to address the autoimmune Hashimoto's component. So what does this mean for the average person that's been diagnosed with hypothyroidism? That's been told that their thyroid function is sluggish, right? This means that there's a chance you've been misdiagnosed and you didn't get a proper diagnosis. I'm a big advocate of ordering thyroid labs, a comprehensive thyroid panel, which includes TSH, Remember, this is a pituitary hormone, and this can be normal for the first 3 stages of Hashimoto's. It can fluctuate throughout, your stage 3. You can have high TSH one day, low TSH another day, and a normal TSH another day. Furthermore, the reference ranges have been skewed over the years because when they determined the ranges for normal thyroid function, there were hypothyroid people in that pool of people, right? And they actually had thyroid reference ranges as high as 10 was considered normal for quite some time. And then it got down to 8. And then it kind of kept getting lower and lower with the years. The functional medicine optimal reference ranges are between 0.5 and 2. And I would argue that people with healthy thyroid function, their TSH should be somewhere right around 1. This is especially important if you are somebody that's symptomatic or if you're somebody that's of childbearing age and you may wish to get pregnant. You really want to keep that TSH right around 1. So I know many doctors will not prescribe thyroid hormones until you're in that stage 4 of Hashimoto's, but I often advocate for prescribing them earlier, sometimes in stage 2 or 3, depending on the person's goals. Of course, there are some people that want to reverse hypothyroidism naturally, and I'm going to get through some of these ways during the podcast, but quite frankly, the fastest way to do that is through thyroid meds, through thyroid hormones. This is going to be the fastest way to get your thyroid hormone levels optimal. Beyond TSH, I also am a big advocate of testing the thyroid hormones. T3 and T4 are the most biologically active thyroid hormones in the body, with T3 being the more biologically active one. Please remember that. This is very, very important. And I typically like to look at free T3 and free T4 because sometimes the thyroid hormones can be bound up by various proteins in the body, and the free T3 and the free T4 lets us know how much free hormone we have to interact with receptors. Another thing I like to test for is reverse T3 if I have an opportunity, because in some cases, reverse T3 can be overly produced, and this can actually block thyroid receptors, which can make a person without thyroid disease, quote unquote, actually experience thyroid symptoms. So this is a very important thing if you suspect you might have thyroid disease or somebody is presenting with some common thyroid symptoms. The other thing to consider, and this is such a big, big recommendation of mine, is to test your thyroid antibodies. Thyroid peroxidase antibodies and thyroglobulin antibodies, TPO and TG antibodies are going to be elevated in the majority of people with Hashimoto's. And there's a lot of controversy about this, and some doctors will say, once we know you have Hashimoto's, we never need to test them again. There are other researchers that say the amount of your thyroid antibodies can be an indirect measure of how aggressive your autoimmune attack is against the thyroid gland. Some experts will disagree with this. In my clinical practice, being a pharmacist specializing in just thyroid disorders over the last 10 years plus, I will say that, the thyroid antibodies do matter. They do correlate with symptoms. The higher the thyroid antibodies, the more aggressive the attack is against the thyroid gland. And we can actually reduce them. And they could be a useful marker of how well our lifestyle interventions are working. So thyroid antibodies, functional medicine range is generally going to be, you should maybe have 0, 1, or 2. Different types of doctors, different types of labs might say under 35 is an optimal range. I would say even if you have thyroid antibodies in the 20s, that's a potential elevation. I oftentimes get the question, what is remission? So generally speaking, from a scientific standpoint, the researchers and literature will say Hashimoto's remission is when the thyroid antibodies, TPO or TG, are under 100. Now, I'm not sure if this is a fair statement because remission is not necessarily a destination. It's oftentimes a journey where if somebody started off with their thyroid antibodies at 5,000 and they're at 300 right now, I'm quite happy with that. If they're not symptomatic, then we can call that a remission, right? And the flip side of that, if somebody had thyroid antibodies of 90 and they're highly symptomatic, and then now they're at like 89, and still very symptomatic, I'm not really going to consider that a remission. Or if they went from like 101 to 99, right? So you really have to look at the person as an individual and their labs, before and after, and consider some of these factors. It's not as clear cut. I'm hoping there will be more research around this. And so I would advocate for testing for thyroid antibodies as well. So I'm going to link in the show notes a full thyroid panel. You can get this through your doctor if you ask. I generally will say most doctors should be willing to order this for you. If they give you any kind of grief for it, I mean, one thing you could say is, I have a family history of this. I would love to know. I would love to test this. You can say one thyroid expert, Mary Shulman, recommends saying, will you note it in my chart that you're declining this test? And a lot of doctors maybe don't want to decline things, so they're more likely to test you for those things. Another option is to find another doctor that's perhaps more willing and more well-versed in autoimmune thyroid disease. And your other option is to self-order those labs. Ulta Labs provides some self-ordering options. And the reason why I love them so much is because, this is, of course, if you're in the United States, is you can self-order and then you can take that receipt and you could submit it to your insurance. Somehow they've worked out this incredible relationship where most insurances will reimburse for those labs you self-order. Now, I want to say, make sure that you check with your insurance companies that they will accept this. And so make sure you call the number on the back of your card just to clarify, because I don't want you to be like, Dr. Wentz, you said that my insurance would reimburse me if I order through Ulta. Let's make sure that they do. So you can actually call and verify that. And they also make them reasonable priced as well if you have a high deductible plan or if you're not able to get insurance reimbursement. So this is a really, really big, important thing to do. And how often should you test your thyroid antibodies is another common question I get. And so you might be wondering that too. Generally speaking, you might see a trend within 4 weeks or so. Like, let's say you tried a lifestyle intervention that you thought would lower your thyroid antibodies and symptoms, and you should see that those antibodies follow within 4 weeks. So you gave up gluten and you want to see if it has an impact on your antibodies. Within 4 weeks, you should be able to test. But the full effect you won't see for at least 3 months. Some of the triggers, like H. pylori, which is a very important trigger of Hashimoto's and Graves' disease and thyroid nodules and thyroid cancer and acid reflux and pernicious anemia, so many things. This could actually take many, many months for the thyroid antibodies to drop. I found this very, very peculiar, but I've looked at studies that show thyroid antibodies for, like 9 months plus after somebody's been had H. pylori and that was eradicated, that they just keep dropping lower and lower. In my experience, if somebody has very high thyroid antibodies, like above 1,000, it's oftentimes going to be H. pylori. I've made that connection in quite a few of my clients. So that's kind of interesting because there could be different reasons why you have Hashimoto's and why you have autoimmunity in the body. Potentially, this could be derived from your impaired stress response. And so that might be really supporting your adrenals, which I get into, and we'll get into that. It could be a toxic burden. And in that point, liver support is really important. We'll get into that too in future episodes. And then it could also be a gut-related issue such as H. pylori. And then, this is going to be kind of a different thing that you would utilize. Now, there are some commonalities in the Hashimoto's approach. Most people will have some kind of food sensitivities, nutrient deficiencies. They might have infections. They might have an impaired stress response, a toxic backlog, intestinal permeability. I think I already mentioned chronic infections, but if not, chronic infections. And so there are some people that I've worked with that are like very easy cases where it's like, oh, you had a gluten sensitivity. We took that away. Your Hashimoto's went away. Or you had a deficiency of selenium and you overdid it on iodine for a short time period. we're going to put you on a low iodine protocol, give you a little bit of selenium, and then the thyroid function antibodies come back to normal. And these are the people that I would call like my perfect cases, because it's like I do one thing and everything turns around, right? Now, in the real world, there's not a ton of people like that. There are many more people that might have more than one food sensitivity, and they might have more than one nutrient deficiency. I'm going to be talking about a lot of different root causes throughout this podcast, and I might even be talking through a lot of different solutions. I've been writing my thyroidpharmacist.com blog since 2013, and one of the things that people often ask me is like, do I have to take every supplement? Do I have every single root cause? And I'm like, oh my gosh, that is so not my intention, is to think that people have every root cause and they need to take every single supplement. My intention is to raise awareness about all the potential causes to help you identify what your cause might be. When I got myself into remission, I knew what my causes were, right? But we're working with clients over the last decade plus and supporting people through my group programs, I've learned about so many additional root causes. And so, just to give you like a tangible example, breast implant illness can cause Hashimoto's. I've never had breast implants. I still had Hashimoto's, right? And so another person, perhaps where they had breast implants and they developed Hashimoto's after, that could be their root cause. Another root cause might be Lyme disease that you can get from tick infection or tick bites, right? And so I've never had that, but for another person, that might be a very relevant root cause. And so I just hope that makes a lot of sense. I know I get people writing in and I get people asking those questions. They're like, do I have to take every supplement? And some people might be deficient in iron or ferritin. And this is very, very common. But again, it's not everybody that is deficient in this. But what I recommend is learning about the condition so you could advocate for yourself, so you could get the right testing. We'll get into nutrient deficiencies in future episodes. I have so much I want to share with you, and I'm so excited to be here on this podcast with you to tell you how you can take charge of your own health. Another question I get is, I have hypothyroidism, but I've been tested for thyroid antibodies. I don't have them, therefore I don't have Hashimoto's. Now, there is a condition known as seronegative Hashimoto's. There's also seronegative rheumatoid arthritis, just to get on a little tangent. But what it is essentially, you still have Hashimoto's, but you just don't test positive for the thyroid antibodies. What does that mean exactly? That means that you still have immune cell infiltration within your thyroid gland and immune activation in your thyroid gland. So could you do another test for that? You can get a thyroid ultrasound, and that would show if you have that typical thyroid gland appearance that is of Hashimoto's. So this is another way that some people get diagnosed when they don't have thyroid antibodies, is through a thyroid ultrasound. Now, some people might not have enough damage or enough infiltration in their thyroid gland, but they still might have Hashimoto's even with a negative ultrasound and negative thyroid antibodies. Of course, this is a very small percentage, but I know I want to make sure I address you, because just because you're in the small percentage doesn't mean that you're not important. Some people might find that they have thyroid nodules on an ultrasound, and then they do a little biopsy of the nodules where they suck up a little bit of your thyroid through a little tiny needle, and they put it under a microscope, and they'll see those immune cells. And so this is another way that that Hashimoto's can be diagnosed. Of course, this is a very, very invasive procedure, and so most people do not get that. And looking at that, I'll have to link the article in the show notes, but the rates of Hashimoto's are higher than the ones that are found through antibody testing. So, what I'm saying is, all that to say is, if you have hypothyroidism and you're living in the Western world, there's a really good chance that you actually have Hashimoto's. And I am willing to bet like $10 on that, maybe $100. So very highly likelihood. Now, what about if you have, what are the other causes, right? So I already talked about if you have your thyroid gland removed, if you have radioactive iodine on your thyroid gland if you're born without a thyroid. The other causes can be that reverse T3 phenomenon, where essentially you're overproducing a thyroid hormone known as reverse T3. Reverse T3 is like your brakes. So if you were to think of T3 as your gas, reverse T3 is like slow things down. And what it does is it blocks thyroid receptors so that T3 can't get in and activate them. And so some people might have high levels of reverse T3, and this causes them to have thyroid symptoms, even though they might not have like actual Hashimoto's and they might not have thyroid dysfunction. They still might have a normal TSH. I would say a TSH up to like 3. So in that case, it's usually some kind of a stress response. They're under extreme stress that's driving this reverse T3 production. My 4th book is Adrenal Transformation Protocol, and that very much focuses on that. Or it could actually be low ferritin. So ferritin is an iron storage protein, and it is important for utilization of thyroid hormone in the body. And so when we don't have enough of that, we might have an overproduction of reverse T3, and we might have a lot of these thyroid symptoms. Now, I will say if you have Hashimoto's, you could also still have reverse T3 issues, and you could still have ferritin issues and adrenal issues. So just because you have high reverse T3 doesn't mean you don't have Hashimoto's, right? A lot of times, though, for many people, they have to address more than one thing to feel like themselves again. Research studies have shown that people on T4 thyroid hormone continue to struggle with symptoms, especially if they're low in vitamin D and if their ferritin is low. Once their vitamin D levels are replenished, my optimal is like 60 to 80. And once their ferritin is replenished, my optimal is like 90 to 110. Then they actually end up feeling good, even with T4 thyroid hormones. Now, T4 thyroid hormones, this is like a sneak preview, but most thyroid medications on the market contain levothyroxine, which is the T4 thyroid hormone. And this is known as a prodrug to pharmacologists like myself. T4 converts to T3, the more active drug, the more active hormone. And this conversion happens beautifully on paper. There's an iodine molecule taken off from T4 to make T3, and this happens, really great on paper. It doesn't always happen so well in the actual human body. And there could be a lot of reasons for this. So it could be that stress, it could be low ferritin. It could also be a dozen of other nutrient deficiencies. Or some people just might have the genetic predisposition, about 10%, maybe 50% of people. They're just never going to be able to convert T4 to T3, no matter how well their ferritin is optimized, no matter how low stress they are. And so in that case, what might really work for these individuals is utilizing a combination thyroid medication that contains both T4 and T3. I'm going to get into thyroid medications. I'm going to get into adrenals. I'm going to get into the liver and gut, as well as share information on how to overcome specific symptoms with Hashimoto's. And I'm going to do a deeper dive into reducing thyroid antibodies. But for now, I hope this little podcast was helpful to you to share a little bit more about whether you have Hashimoto's, hypothyroidism, or both. I hope this conversation has been healing on your thyroid journey. Until next time.